Thank you for joining us for our 7th International Conference. We're kicking it off with a session based on science and behavior, and that ties into our work with the Global Thresholds and Allocations Council primarily, but really all of our work is predicated on what it is that the science is telling us that is necessary for us to achieve as a human species in terms of our impact on the world that could be at the very least sustainable, if not thrivable. And that ties into the behaviors that we conduct as human beings in an ethical framework that takes all humans into account. And so that's what we'll be exploring for the next 90 minutes or so. We have 4 great keynote speakers for you. Alan White from the TELUS Institute, Professor Harold Sverdrup, Michelle Holliday, author of The Age of Thrivability, and Jane Huang from Social Accountability International. And so we are going to start with keynotes from each of those speakers, which we will then follow up with an interactive question and answer dialogue. And so again, we encourage you to add your questions in the chat box. We will be curating those behind the scenes. We have a Cleophea Michelson on the R3.0 team who will be helping Ralph and me curate those questions into the session. Please, if possible, direct your questions to a specific speaker. And so first up, we're going to have Alan White. And Alan White is one of our ambassadors at R3.0. Our relationship with Alan goes way back. In fact, Ralph worked with him at the onset of the Global Reporting Initiative at the turn of the millennium. And Alan plays a key role in having spurred the idea of a Global Thresholds and Allocations Council back in 2012 at a meeting in the TELUS Institute. So we will kick things off with Alan presenting on this notion of thresholds and allocations. And it is a concept that is embedded in the Global Reporting Initiative's sustainability context principle. So those of you who are relatively new to the R3.0 ecosystem, that is an area where we draw much of our inspiration, is that notion of context as it relates to thresholds and allocations. And then following Alan, we will have Jane Huang, who will be speaking about an implementation of thresholds and allocations at the company level with a new certification and standard process looking at triple bottom line organizations. Okay, so we are ready for Alan. Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Bill, and greetings to everybody. I've titled this brief presentation, Rhyming Planetary Science and Planetary Governance. At the moment, we are not rhyming the two as we think about science and we think about its implications for governance. We have ways to go before these are in sync. And if they're not in sync, we will continue to struggle with managing our ecosystems, our human systems, and generally the possibilities for the future. The idea of a GTAC, a Global Thresholds and Allocation Council, again, Bill mentioned, is several years old now. And it arose from a very set of simple premises. One is doing better is not doing enough. Enough requires us to understand and articulate what do we mean by enough. Enough emissions or too much emissions. Enough fair wages or not fair wages. Human rights violations. uh, occupational health and safety. What is enough in terms of living within either scientific boundaries or boundaries set by ourselves, we human beings, which we generally call norms, acceptable norms of conduct, of behavior, and of performance. To do that is a complicated process. It's not surprising. It's taken us many years to vet and revet it. And at the end of the day, what we're seeking to achieve here is a missing element, which is a trusted, independent global source or entity or process in which thresholds and allocations are determined, set forward, and adapted and adopted. Today, we stand at what we call, in the language of a great transition with a larger framework we'll hear about now, at a branch point, 2020. I think all of us appreciate how seminal this moment is. The confluence of major crises, both public health, of social and social equities and disparities, and of course, climate as well. So we have this confluence, and we're at these moments in time, depending on how you interpret a branch point. One may have been perhaps in 1989 with the rearrangement of the geopolitics in Europe and the former Soviet Union. We may call a branch point the Great Depression of the early 30s, or many other branch points, seminal and semi-seminal, if you wish. The Industrial Revolution was a branch point. The Scientific Revolution was a branch point. So perhaps we're not quite at that level of consequence, but we certainly are one where major choices face us, and we better get them right. In this initiative I referred to briefly, this has been now 2 decades old, originally launched by a number of people, colleagues at TELUS Institute and the Swedish Stockholm Environment Institute. We envisioned several futures, ways of thinking about the future and how to get there. So let me quickly show those to you just very briefly. One we call conventional worlds. This is a world of, you can see at the bottom of your screen, I believe, a number of characteristics: market-driven, individualism, competition, the assumption that a rising tide lifts all boats, limitless growth. In fact, growth is the goal of the economy in this scenario, and a violation, of course, not surprisingly, which we're facing today, a violation of planetary boundaries as well as social norms. So that's the market forces version of conventional worlds. In a second version, this is part B, if you will, or an alternative, things get a bit better. Government intervention to tame the most adverse effects of unfettered markets, ecological damage, and social disparities, but they all persist. And the idea of green capitalism, reinventing capitalism, reimagining capitalism, all these are worthy and current visions, as we hear in our daily discourse, but the constraints are always still there: political will, foresight, integrity. And we have come up generally short on these, and therefore our policy reforms are still falling short of what's needed for a true thrivable future, as Bill likes to say. Barbarization, a second heading, is a societies where order through authoritarianism is imposed. Divisiveness, xenophobia, nativism, rule through social control, retreat into enclaves, the poor get marginalized. This kind of fortress world is one of, again, extreme disparities, rising authoritarianism, and we only need to look around the global landscape these days, take your pick, to see that this is a rising tide, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Cambodia, Philippines, the list is long. Some are at the cusp, Venezuela, others not, but headed that way. Even the US, of course, faces its own challenge of a fortress world, as we call it. An alternate version of barbarization is breakdown. Think Yemen, uh, think Libya, perhaps, countries where basically have unraveled and what we might call, in short, failed states. In a great transition scenario that we might aspire to, we see two levels of it. One, a very localistic level, where bioregionalism, localism, face-to-face democracy, small is beautiful. Small systems function at local levels, and people the emphasis is on self-sufficiency. A parallel version, these are not mutually exclusive. Don't think of these as oppositional, but rather complementary. We have a sense of solidarity, ecological stewardship, well-being, justice, inclusiveness, all values that certainly everyone watching this screen probably shares. Within those systems, we have learned to identify and measure and practice living within systems boundaries, whether it's social or ecological systems. We have found our compass and we are obedient to, we respect those norms and boundaries which nature or humans have given themselves. So there's lots of precedents to this line of thinking, of course. I won't go through all of these. I'm sure you're familiar with most. Limits to Growth. Back in 1972 here, we're talking 50 years ago, the Brundtland Report, GRI, put forward its version of boundaries and thresholds in its sustainability context principle, where reporting corporate activities, measurement, performance must be reported, should be reported in the context of thresholds, not just absolute numbers, but thresholds and norms, social, ecological, as well as governance. In 2009, the planetary boundaries, a safe operating space concept, was introduced by Johan Rockström from Sweden, of course, now Donut Economics by Kate Rayworth, the SDGs, and in 2019, the Global Commons Alliance. I give you these precedents because we are not breaking new ground here. What we are trying to do is bring all the ground that has been broken to a next step and to bind these efforts into a wholeness that will deliver the goods in the next few years, and those goods being generally accepted planetary boundaries and norms that everyone subscribes to, everyone adheres to. Now, again, from the standpoint of learning from governance, we have these examples, and these are just a handful: WHO, WTO, ILO, GRI, of course, now taking its adopting or becoming a generally recognized standard, not entirely, not worldwide, not by everybody, but certainly thousands of companies are doing it, and 60 plus governments subscribing through regulation, through law, or other form of adoption. The Bank of International Settlements, now about 20 years old. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, again, about 2 decades old. So you see these in play, they are operating, and they give us a sense of possibility of a planetary cohesion, a planetary universe where there is respect for commonly held values, whether they be human rights, whether they be transparency, whether they be labor standards. Note, very importantly, these are a blend of enforceable, legally binding, so-called hard law and norms-based, generally accepted soft law. What's missing in that list? Well, in my own view, there's a couple of elements missing. One is a World Tax Equity Organization. I won't go into detail on any of these, but these are ideas floating in my head and the head of colleagues at the moment. A second is called the World Corporate Charter Organization, recognizing the disjuncture between where companies are incorporated, licensed to operate, and where in fact they do operate, which is worldwide. Why don't we have a world charter to complement or even supplant perhaps national charters? And thirdly, and the subject of this discussion, the GTAC. So again, 2022, I picked a date, 23, 24, take your pick, the creation of a trusted authoritative body, multi-stakeholder in nature, to research and disseminate and apply thresholds and allocations across all dimensions of sustainability. By 2025, these thresholds and allocations become generally accepted and begin the road from generally accepted soft law to those that become over time enforceable, or in the terminology of this language, hard law. We can imagine GTAC in various structures, augment the mission of an existing entity, joint venture involving multiple initiatives together that converge and cohere, and each play a role collectively, a wholeness, but separately different missions, or a new standalone entity. We have, of course, in play, including in this meeting, there'll be voices of IPCC, Science-Based Targets Initiative, Global Commons Alliance, very important, GRI, National Capital Coalition. All these are 3.0, of course. All these have something to say, have something to contribute to this combination of GTAC, to this idea we call GTAC. What's critical to all this is integrity, independence, and inclusiveness. That's the foundation for building a durable, credible, authentic, and legitimate entity in the next few years. So it's a moment of action. We see mounting violations of safe and just operating spaces, whether they be social spaces, ecological spaces, and there is truly, this is an existential moment. We can't keep doing what we're doing with boundary breaking and overshooting on the one hand and undershooting on the other. We're in this moment, the 2020 moment, the pandemic moment, and the multiple crises is a kind of crucible. That means a test for our capacity to respond creatively, to build a governance entity that is prepared for the moment. My own view of this kind of change is threefold, very simply. It's all about timing, it's about leadership, and back to number two, shared grievance. The challenge, that whether it's GRI or many other initiatives, is to find those overlapping circles among disparate parties where everyone, maybe for different reasons, believes that there is a solution within reach, and go for that solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That is very familiar to us at R3.0. I still remember the meeting at TELUS Institute after the presentation on context-based sustainability by Mark McElroy, where the three of us sat around and you said, maybe we need a global governance body for this. So we certainly didn't anticipate that R3.0 would be the organization that would be spurring that. But here we are, and we're glad to hear from other organizations that are heading in the same direction. Speaking thereof, Jane Huang is next up with Social Accountability International, and her organization is doing just that. They're essentially translating the sustainability context principle, which has been on the books for almost 2 decades, as Alan mentioned, into a standard and certification process. Those of you who know SAI will know that they are foremost globally as a not-for-profit that is applying certification primarily to labor standards. And so Jane is going to share with us the triple bottom line organization certification that she and SAI are developing. So over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks to everyone at R3.0, and thanks to everyone for joining. Pleasure to be here. We're just, excuse me, just here in the United States, coming off our Labor Day holiday, which is meant to celebrate the achievements of the labor rights movement in the U.S. Decades ago. It's a sobering moment in time to reflect on how far we've come since then, or perhaps regressed. And as Alan said, this moment in time, the pandemic and multiple crises, what it means for labor, not just in the U.S., but around the world. If anything, we looking at as a labor rights organization for SAI, it's just this this moment has really just compounded again just the interconnectedness of human rights all around the world, global supply chains. And just as we think about impacts and as we think about growth and inclusiveness, what it means to have that intersection of looking at local impact and local governance in a global context. So I'm sure that many of you have seen these images from COVID. These are migrant workers, more than 8 million, that had to walk hundreds of kilometers home, after factories across India were shut down. These workers that are working under exploitative conditions in many circumstances, and without savings, not even able to afford staying where they were, or even to make the journey back home other than through walking. And now they sit sort of waiting for the rest of the world to come back. Of course, India is still shut down in many places due to the pandemic, but a lot of, whether these workers can return to work or not depends a lot on whether consumer demand in the West also returns. This is another image from our work with partners on distributing food and medical supplies to waste pickers in Brazil. These are workers that sort of pick through, sort through, recycle garbage, so and recycle paper and plastics, aluminum, sorting through many companies like HP, Kimberly-Clark, Johnson & Johnson we're partnering with that are, have made these commitments to circular economies and improving their environmental impact. And actually, part of their global chain right now is actually these waste pickers that actually have to go through, from dump sites, picking through this garbage. And many of them also in the pandemic were left without basic sustenance. I bring up these images just as a reminder again. I think the obvious point is just how interconnected we are. And again, this idea, it's listening to friends talk about just, even if we are going back to regular consumption, just how supply chains have been disrupted everywhere from basic essentials, food, medicine, but also non-essential goods. I just discovered from friends who had to deal with their kids in quarantine that trampolines, outdoor toys are the latest good that's been affected by disruptions and in short supply. But as we all think about sort of how interconnected we are and what return to work looks like, safe return, and a return to a world where it's not the old normal, but where we tackle inequality, where we tackle climate change, where we tackle all these crises together in a more transformative way. How can we do that in a way that empowers more of the people around the world that are at lower tiers of supply chain that so far have not had a voice? As Ellen is talking about, looking globally at a global allocation threshold, looking collectively at what that means for all of us. And he brought up a point about local, just what that means to have the local stakeholder input as well. So, this idea of companies, businesses thinking about working in global supply chains, thinking about environmental and social impacts is not new. They've been reporting through GRI and other methods for a long time now, making good advances. There's definitely growing investor and consumer interest, which is good. I think coming out of these current crises, there will be even more so. But the quality of what companies are reporting on, the quality of the actions, looking at not just impacts on their own operations, but impacts on outsourced activities all around the world, impacts globally, transnational, cross boundaries. And then this idea of scientific thresholds. For the most part, most of the objectives on sustainability have been decided at I would say a fairly philanthropic level, at a public relations level, very little understanding of the full breadth of the company's impact, but then also the context and what those, what the company's role is with respect to scientific thresholds. And this holds true in environment and also in social issues that some might say are not as perhaps quantifiable or scientific. A lot of the work we've been doing recently is on actually finding more objective evidence-based measures of things like living wages, living income. So if you are a chocolate company thinking about really looking at your impact and looking at thresholds, looking at truly contributing not to a regenerative economy, then how can you measure, through the prices that you pay, the sourcing practices, how you enable smallholder farmers, cacao farmers, to have a living income, and how is that living income measured in terms of objective, normative requirements of what households need, what families need, in terms of food, in terms of decent housing, in terms of education, in terms of savings, things that actually help the local economy to regenerate. But then also, how does that living income enable the true cost of production for farmers to truly take care of their land, to invest in their land, to make sure that their farming practices are also regenerative. So those, we believe, are actually measurable. They can be tied to normative standards as well as local contexts of development and stakeholder needs, and done through sort of both a research and a stakeholder consultation-based process. We believe that it is possible. And so what we're heading towards is, as Bill mentioned, is launching together with a Center for Sustainable Organizations, and we will do a roundtable on this tomorrow, is the idea of a triple bottom line accounting framework and certification for companies to truly incorporate this concept of multi-capital thinking and accounting, truly embedding that into the company and thinking, across boundaries, across operations, across supply chains around the world, but also thinking with the same precision and resource allocation and controls and processes that financial accounting has taken to date, and really building upon sort of what one entity, what company, one organization within an ecosystem can do. And I think that's the challenge here, is helping companies to think in this system, to do this kind of systems thinking, but then not to be overwhelmed, but actually then to be able to make, to understand what it itself can do and within the system to make that kind of transformation. So we're hoping that this TBL accounting framework and certification can really build on, take the concept of this global resource allocation council and see how the company can apply it to itself and in a way that can be credible and independently verified. So this is just in, we started, this has its roots, decades of thinking, but as Alan said, everything has its own time. And we were launching this pre-COVID, but I think now accelerating this, and I think the time is ripe. So looking forward to talking with you all more about it tomorrow as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jane. And we at R3.0 are certainly very excited about the TBL organization certification process since we very first heard about it. So we're very glad to have you speaking in this keynote. And also, as you mentioned, many, if not most, of our keynote speakers will be joining the interactive breakouts, and we've gone to a full interactive mode in response to you, our community globally, asking for more interactivity. So you'll have an opportunity to delve much deeper into the TBL organization certification process tomorrow. Next up, we have Michelle Holliday, author of The Age of Thrivability. So over to you, Michelle.
All right. Thank you, Bill. And hi, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you in this opening session of the conference, a session that is dedicated to this thematic pairing of science and behavior. And the hope, it seems, is that the science will be able to influence behavior change within companies and for the people who are inside of and around the companies. And so I'd like to spend a little bit of time in that space in the middle, exploring that space where influence is to happen, because it's clearly not quite as straightforward as this. And it's also clearly not working quite as well as we'd like it to. And that's why we find quotes like this one from Dennis Meadows, who was one of the authors of that Limits to Growth report and of the world simulation model that we might hear about in a bit. So this is an interview from 2 weeks ago in which he says, I spent 50 years trying to help people understand their realistic options and choose a bit more wisely for their long term. I would say, by and large, I have failed. I don't think the planet is going to evolve any different from my having been around than it would have if I had not been conceived. This is a heartbreaking thing to read. And I don't think it's true. I think he's clearly had an impact. And at the same time, there's some truth to what he's saying. Over the past 50 years, the data has only gotten more compelling and more visible, and the stakes have only gotten higher. And yet we still haven't seen the massive wave of change that the data would seem to warrant. And so we have to ask, where does the science fall short of influencing behavior? Well, here's what I have observed. To influence behavior, data has to land in the fertile soil of a worldview that's capable of integrating it. Even our most compelling data isn't self-sufficient. It always lands within a pre-existing story or context. And over the past 50 years and more, much of the world has operated within a mechanistic worldview that tells us that everything operates like a machine, especially our organizations. That story tells us that we are separate from each other, separate from nature, separate from our organizations. It tells us that the only thing that matters is productivity and profitability. And it tells us that we exist to compete and consume. So when our best, most compelling sustainability data lands within that story, within that soil, it just lies dormant and unrealized. We're able to hear the data, but we're not able to take it in. And within that worldview, people aren't able to imagine different ways of being. And so the data leads at best to minimal compliance, and at worst to resistance and cognitive dissonance. And this is what leads to the stuckness that Dennis Meadows was talking about. But sometimes it does work. Sometimes the soil is fertile and behavior change is the result. So many of us are familiar already with the story of Ray Anderson, for example. He was the founder of Interface Carpets, a company that did undergo dramatic behavior change as a result of what Ray talked about as his spear in the chest moment. And so was it the data that led to the spear in the chest moment for him? He talked about reading Paul Hawken's book, The Ecology of Commerce. And of course, there was data in that book. But more than that, there was a new worldview. Ray talked about how Paul convicted him as a plunderer of the earth. That is a new story about himself and his role in the world and his company's role in the world. Theft of our children's future will someday be a crime, Ray said. We are part of the web of life. We have a choice to hurt it or to help it. And it's this expanded story that created fertile ground into which the data could then be integrated and lead to behavior change. So we can also look to Indigenous communities around the world that are widely recognized as wise and responsible stewards of the Earth's ecosystems. And that's the behavior we want, right? So are they better stewards because they have access to better data? In some ways they do, or at least they have access to different data. But it's their worldview that makes them more attuned to that data. It's their guiding story that enables them to integrate the data and translate that into more responsible behavior. And more life-aligned behavior. So for us in this community, what it means is that as we gather better data, as we develop better reporting methods, as we create more guiding institutions at a global level, we also have to take into account the worldview that they exist within. And the good news is that a more life-aligned worldview is growing in prominence, even among non-Indigenous populations. But that worldview is not yet fully understood. And in particular, it's not well understood how it's different from earlier approaches. So I want to dig into that a little bit. Within this diagram, the figures on the left side in black represent the progression of the mechanistic worldview. So on the far left, we have linear approaches in a process of take, make, and waste. And from there, we moved into trying to do less harm in approaches like recycling. And as it became clear that even that wasn't enough, we moved into the sustainability movement and circularity in an effort to maintain a steady state. And what more of us are realizing now is that even sustainability and even circularity are not enough, that we've done so much damage to our ecosystems that we need to actively restore them. And more than that, we're starting to realize that what's needed and what's possible is to align with life's inherent ability to generate and regenerate itself continuously over time. What's needed is to align with life's ability to thrive. What's needed is to cultivate what many of us are starting to call thrivability in support of life's ability to thrive at every level for individuals, for organizations and communities as ecosystems, as living ecosystems, and for the biosphere. And I think of this work as the informed intention and practice of creating the fertile conditions for life to thrive at all of those levels. Informed because if we're going to create those fertile conditions, then we need to know, what does that take? What does that require of us? And then we have to set that as our clear intention. Because if we don't make enabling life to thrive our explicit goal, then we'll never get there. And finally, we need to acknowledge that thrivability and regeneration are a life practice, an ongoing individual and collective practice of stewarding life and aligning with life's principles. So if we start with being informed, I'd like to share the 4 design principles that we find in every living system, whether it's our bodies or a rainforest or an organization or a community. These are the fertile conditions that we have to cultivate if we're going to enable life to thrive in any living system. So the first thing we need to know is that in any thriving living system, we find diverse parts that are connected and supported in patterns and structures of relationship in a way that enables the emergence of a new whole, a new level of life with new capabilities and characteristics that we don't find at the level of the parts. And that's the magic we're after with living systems, right? That the whole is greater than the sum of its parts and that new things become possible. And what powers that process, what enables the magic to happen, is life. It's whatever spark it is that animates us and makes us alive. Anything that is alive is inherently self-organizing, self-integrating, integrating parts into wholeness, self-generating, and self-regenerating, or self-healing, because it is alive. And we don't have to know or agree what this spark of life is or where it comes from, but we do have to acknowledge it. Because if we don't, then we stay stuck within that mechanistic story that tells us we are drivers of the machine, when instead what's needed is to shift to seeing ourselves as stewards or gardeners of something precious and alive. So let me give you an example from my work. I work with a group of farmers in Ontario who are trying to transition to regenerative methods of agriculture. They have abundant data, science and data available about why that transition is needed and how they can track their progress along the way. And there's just a handful of methods that constitute regenerative agriculture. So it ought to be simple and straightforward. The science ought to influence the behavior directly. But of course it doesn't. It doesn't work quite that well. It turns out that there's far more complexity involved than it appears. And I suspect that's the case for every industry and every context. So it turns out for these farmers that every piece of land has different needs, every crop, every week seems to bring up new challenges and questions. And so what they discovered is that they also need a community of practice and learning and support to help them find their way. And within that learning community, they were able to come to understand that this transition to regenerative methods also changes how they understand their role and who they are. The mechanistic story told them that they're the ones who grow the plants with their chemicals and their equipment. But within the regenerative movement, they're coming to understand that it's the soil. It's the living system that is the soil that does the work of growing the plants and more. And so they're coming to see that their role is to create the fertile conditions for life to work its magic. Their role is to be stewards of something precious and alive. And it was only really with that understanding, embracing that worldview, that the science and data were really able to be integrated and to lead to meaningful behavior change. And with that transition, they were able to deepen their inquiry and their work together and to find their way to this powerful question: what if healing the soil and healing our relationship with soil is essential to healing ourselves, our community, and our world. This was their stake in the heart moment when they came to this question. And in broadening and deepening their work and their inquiry together, they were also able to reach out to more of their community beyond the farming community and engage them in the inquiry as well. And as a result, systems change now becomes possible. So if we go back to my original observation, if this is the one thing that I hope you'll take away from my talk, if we want science and data to change behavior, then we have to plant it within a story of aliveness. And we probably also have to gather and support communities of learning that can live into that new story together and in context and over time. I believe these are key aspects to the work that's needed going forward. So thank you.
Great, Michelle. Thank you very much. And thank you in particular for introducing the concept of thrivability. Of course, that's an area where we have intersected. Ralph and I did work with the Thrivability Foundation a few years ago. So it's great to have that concept of mindset and worldview planted into this conference. Now, next up, you were expecting Harold Sverdrup, and the strange thing is that when we first met Harold, he was wearing this pair of maroon jeans. And on that same day, I was wearing a pair of maroon jeans, and I was like, that's really odd that we would choose to wear the same pants. And as it turns out, that was a freakish preview of where we are heading next, which is Harold was unable to make the session today. So I am going to, on the fly, present his slides. Luckily, I have seen this presentation before at a Club of Rome meeting in the fall, a version of these slides. So I will ask your forgiveness for the imprecision of presentation, but I will do the best that I can with the knowledge that I have. I would also ask folks to please add your questions to the chat box. As we mentioned, we are collecting those and we'll use those for curating a round of conversation after these presentations. So this is a presentation that would have been given by Harold Sverdrup. As you can see, he is from the Norwegian Inland University in Norway with his colleagues. And this is a presentation about resource dynamics. Okay, and okay, I am on full screen. Okay, thank you. So what is Harold using? The World 7 is an evolution of the modeling that was used in the original Limits to Growth report from 1972. It actually originated before that with Jay Forrester at MIT and the birth of systems dynamics. It was developed into a third generation called World 3 with the Dana and Dennis Meadows team that Michelle just referenced. And that model looked at all of the dynamics that we know of in the world in terms of resource use, as well as thresholds around the carrying capacities that the Earth systems can handle around resource use. So really the story picks up in 2011 when Harold Sverdrup adopted the world's model and as you can see, developed it through 4 subsequent generations, such that now what we are using is a World 7 model. And that has integrated new dynamics and new abilities, in particular, looking at whole system cross-linked feedbacks. And so this is taking into more account the social dynamics that were not capable of being addressed in earlier versions of the world model. So this is a simple example of all of the variables that the World 7 model takes into account, in particular, looking at the feedback loops. And our understanding is that Harold Sverdrup and his team went back and back tested the world models against the real world development. So essentially, how on target was the World 3 model in its predictions? And he used that in order to refine the World 7 system. So this is an example of the feedback loops that he was taking into account. This also looks at the natural resources, metals, and materials that are all addressed. These are all resources that we rely on for our modern industrial society. And these are ones that are in limited supply. So whereas Michelle and Jane mentioned the idea of regeneration, only some of the materials that we rely on can be regenerated, at least at human timescales. The materials that we are looking at here are finite, and therefore they have limited supplies that we must take into account. So this is a graph that's looking at what we want as compared to what is possible to achieve. So as you can see from the blue line, what we want is far outstripping what we can actually supply to ourselves. So the red line in particular, taking a downward trajectory after the resources that we rely on and want run into problems. As you can see, the mining is the first to start on the downslope as we use the already mined materials through recycling, but even recycling has its limits. Therefore, in other words, the circular economy has its limits. These are all 3 different methodologies for assessing these limits to growth or these limits of resources. One is a simple mass balance and burn-off rate of these 40 elements. So mass balance is essentially you look at a pie and you count up if everything fits within that pie or if you're counting on more than one pie. And as we know, the world is only one pie. The Hubbard's curves, looking at 16 different elements. Hubbard, of course, in the 1950s, predicted the depletion curve of oil and fossil fuels in particular. And then finally, the World 7 model similarly looks at 43 metals, elements, and materials. So a robust empirical background here. Key technology metals have limited supply. So we know that we are relying on a major transformation into renewable energy. However, renewable, while the energy of the sun and wind can be renewed, the technology that it is based on, including photovoltaics, rechargeable batteries, high-performance magnets, electric generators, and electromotors all rely on these materials that actually are in limited supply. So the term renewable energy refers to the energy itself, not necessarily to the infrastructure needed to harvest that energy. So here we see a look at some of these key materials and the curves of their use leading to depletion rate. So we're seeing the same things that we saw in other charts, that downward trajectory that is concerning. So taking one look, and this is something that the breakout tomorrow will look at in more depth, looking at the research of Copper8, and Cecile from that organization has done a look at the resources that electric vehicles need, particularly the idea of lithium and cobalt. This basically projects, I believe, a use demand that outstrips what we will be able to supply. The other key issue is not just resource quantity, but also resource quality. So even before the quantity runs out, the quality begins to degrade. I mean, this idea that we can simply substitute alternative resources, what we don't realize is that we are now, our infrastructure relies on these high quality resources. And as time goes on and as we use up those resources, literally the quality of them degrades, such that the quality of the systems and infrastructure that they undergird similarly degrades. And so that is a troubling dynamic. Then we get to the question of energy return on investment, the idea that we are accustomed to a high energy return. If we look at the year 1900 and the idea of oil, it returned a very high level of energy for the amount of energy that you put into it. And as we move along, that energy return depletes. So what we are seeing is multiple different examples of this kind of depletion. And here is a graphic on looking at the extraction peak. So again, that's the Hubbard's notion of a peak where it's only downslope after that, and on the downslope is typically when the degradation happens quality-wise. The supply peak, so that's when actually the supply will hit its highest level. And then the recycling degrees is also the degrees to which we can continue to circulate that. But each of these is reaching a maximum in the upcoming years, as you can see on this graphic. So the point here being that we are soon running into these limits to growth that have been mythologized, that they don't exist and that we can make our way around them. What the research says is that is not the case. So this is the graphic that was most telling to us. It was the resource supply challenges, and this is the number of challenges charted against the timeline. And as you can see, what this curve is telling us is a middle finger is the interpretation that essentially, in some ways, this is the world giving that signal to us, in part because we are giving that signal to the world. We are not respecting these resources, and this is the message coming back to us, is that we cannot continue on this kind of resource use. So there is an imperative that we shift our dependencies to resources that are renewable, and we shift our infrastructure to ways that uses the resources within the timelines that they are available. So this is showing how actually, as we've got negative curves in all of the other instances, we have upward curves in terms of the quality decline, cost, and effort. All of those go up in order to maintain our trajectories of consumption. So the message here is that we have to shift our patterns of consumption, as Michelle was pointing out. Here are some of Jorgen Randers, who is an original author, co-author, along with Dana and Dennis Meadows, of the Limits to Growth study, and I will leave these up for a moment for you to read. I'm not going to go through all of these. Obviously, Harold would have much greater familiarity with them than I do. But the point here is that World 7 is integrating all of these into its modeling, so that the sentiments of an original co-author of the Limits to Growth is being represented in this World 7 implementation. So finally, in conclusion, what we're looking at is a need for a systemic approach. So right now we are applying sectoral approaches that are not looking at the cross-cutting nature of these challenges. So our work on the Global Thresholds and Allocations Council, for example, we are primarily looking at the thresholds of the Earth's ability to assimilate these problems. We have not looked at the actual resource constraints themselves. And so this was a message to us around the Global Thresholds and Allocations Council that it actually needs to integrate resource thresholds as well. Looking at a circular society, we would actually say a cyclical society is what is needed, such that these materials continue to circulate. We also need to look at the causally linked interactions. Essentially, all fundamental systems are needing to go through transformative change. And right now, what we are looking at is primarily incremental change. And so that's part of the work that we have been looking at R3.0 that aligns with this, is the need to up our ambition level to the level of transformative change. And then finally, we need to look at a timeline where we project at least 20 years so that we know what our goals are in 2040 and we can adjust accordingly as we go along. As he says at the end here, we must engage all arenas, science, communication, and political. And so it is this question of bridging science with the political and communications, and I would add behavioral realms. So that brings us to the end of this presentation by Harold Sverdrup, otherwise known as Bill Bowie.
All right, thank you, Bill. I am extremely thankful that we had these good preparation sessions before the conference, because we don't know why Harold was unable to join us, but I think Bill did a great job in presenting what Harold was about to say. So kudos, Bill. Thank you very much for doing that. In the meanwhile, we have collected questions. The questions that came in through the chat function on the Vimeo platform, and we collected them, and we looked at a couple of slides that we want to now bring into a panel discussion. And I think the first one that we want to ask comes from a dedication partner of ours, Jesse Henshaw, and is actually addressed to Ellen White. Ellen, the question was, the main driver of growth is an extremely powerful global feedback of profits multiplying investments, which assumes no threshold. Do you know of proposals for defining the threshold other than that some of the sustainable finance proposals? So really thinking about how to implement the idea of thresholds into the idea of finance.
Yeah, well, the question of, I believe, is finance the core of finance, the core of modern finance, is rooted in endless growth and basically no limits to returns. So the search goes on. We call that financialization of the economy, where one capital, finance capital, reigns supreme at the other capitals. A story told many times in many variations, both by R 3.0 and many other people. So if the question, as I understood it, was, is there some way to express or identify, articulate a limit, a threshold, a limit, a container, if you will, to the growth in finance, in financial capital?
Right.
I think I've not seen one. I think it's actually the whole concept of defining that limit is rather obnoxious for those in the financial community. So when we wed ourselves to the day-to-day feed of Dow Jones and FTSE Index and all the other metrics that run across our TV and computer screens every day, with the stocks up, stocks down, exchange traded indexes, even ESG investments, returns, it tells me, at least, that we're nowhere close to the notion that return X 2%, 3%, 1%, or 10% per year is some way acceptable or sustainable or agreeable to the multitudes of investors and multitudes of investment funds. So this is not a satisfactory answer, perhaps, but it's certainly a point of, it's a reality that no, we don't have anything like a consensus on finance capital growth.
Great, thank you, Alan. And I actually, this is an area where this question points to the kind of interweaving that we have curated into this conference. In a subsequent session, John Fullerton will address this very question. And so this is, the answer will be forthcoming as well as what you provided. Next up, a question that is directed to Michelle, and this is from Amy Daniels. Apologies if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, but Amy says, I understand this regenerative notion applied to agriculture, as in the soil doing the work for us, but how does this apply to the more industrial processes in factories? So over to you, Michelle, for thoughts on that question.
Okay. So one of the things that's the focus of my work, and going back to the example of the farmers, one of the things we find is that those same principles that are present in the soil are present in our human communities as well. That we can see ourselves as stewards of that living community, and we can focus on cultivating the conditions for individual people to bring their best talents and contributions and be nourished in the process as diverse parts. We can cultivate the conditions for relationships to flow and be effective and open. And we can gather people together in wholeness and convergence around a shared purpose, a compelling shared purpose. And all of that can be done not through command and control approaches, but through supporting self-organization, self-generation, self-regeneration. So there's, to some extent, a philosophy at play, a worldview in how we create the conditions for work to be done, even within a factory setting. So in an intangible way, this worldview of regeneration is applied to any human context. And that forms the container within which we can explore those more concrete and tangible aspects that Bill was talking about, where we have to attend to the non-renewable resources. But until we bring a worldview that is in alignment with life to our work together, then we bump up against resistance and cognitive dissonance. So that's one answer to how regeneration and thrivability shows up even in a factory context.
Mm-hmm. So it essentially, part of what I'm hearing you say, Michelle, is that we currently are run by systems that are not living systems. We've sort of created the infrastructure that was embedded in Harold's presentation is not predicated on a living systems worldview.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay,
right.
Great. Well, thank you. Next question would go to Jane. And this is, it's looking at, as we've seen, these real world thresholds are what the SAI's triple bottom line organization certification is based on. So it's kind of clear what the real world benefits might be from this. What about the business benefits? How are you framing this in terms of making it attractive to businesses to apply this kind of certification in ways that would help it scale outward?
Thanks, Bill. I think we're looking at it as a business imperative, particularly understanding the context, potential impacts, accounting proactively is ultimately building the resilience, particularly in operations and supply chains, both building productive workforces, building the more inclusiveness, the retention, the well-being of the human capital throughout the company, that has tangible benefits, that working strategically with supply chain, both from a materials and resources side, as well as the supply chain workforce side, that also has not just that has, of course, reputational benefits, the license to operate, but that also, just in terms of, for many of the companies that we're working with, they're already starting to recognize the example I gave, for example, with the cocoa farmers. We have brands that are recognizing that, given the way things are going now, neither the soil from a biodiversity perspective nor from a living income perspective, that they might not have sources of ingredients in near decades because of degradation, but also because it's not a viable living, it's not a viable livelihood for new generations of farmers.
So essentially, part of what I'm hearing you say is that that there is a business case, if you will, for operating within these resource and sustainability thresholds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Okay, I would have another question from Michelle, coming from one of our advocation partners, Paul Adow, from Unusual, and it really bridges also to one of the themes that we're going to discuss by the end of the day. Then has to do with how would education need to also grapple with those challenges. So the question really literally is, how can the educational system add to fertilizing the soil?
Mm-hmm.
It's a good one, I think.
It's a good one, and it's big. So part of what's needed is a shift in how we understand the purpose of education, that it's not only to channel us into jobs. I talk about a shift to learning for life, learning for the wholeness of our lives, learning to be in service of life, learning for the length of our lives. And when I say wholeness, I mean the wholeness of who we are, not only intellect. Learning in ways that are in alignment with life. So creating a learning environment that is thrivable and in which we and everyone involved, the learners and the teachers as guides and the community are nourished. So as one example, I think education needs to be embedded more fully in the community so that there's more relevance, there's more exchange and real opportunity to be in service of life and not off in an abstract setting and separated from life. So lots more. There's a whole avenue of exploration there, but that's one quick answer.
Great, thank you, Michelle. And again, this is a sort of a cross-pollination question, if you will. So later today, of course, we will have the session on governance and education, where that will be a specific focus of attention. Next up, we have a question actually from one of our speakers, one of our provocateurs from a subsequent session, Susan Paulson. And she says that, all of these presentations sort of asked how scientific data and understandings variously succeed or fail to influence individual behaviors. So can you address possibilities for influencing social systems, such as kinship, production, gender, education, that was started to be addressed, that reproduce humans? Habitats, habits, and worldviews. So she didn't specify a particular person for this one. So I'm going to point this first to Alan in terms of your understanding of the social systems, particularly in the corporate and investment spheres. How can we influence those social systems best?
Well, influencing social systems is always reverts to deeper questions of values, power, culture, and knowledge. Those four are the recipe, if you will, for bringing science to the question of elevating, or let's say improving, enhancing the social system such that they provide foundation for thrivability, if I may use the popular term. So as we go about thinking about what is the social system is a big umbrella, of course. There's different aspects to it. There's education, there's work, there's play, there's leisure, there's interrelationships, and all kinds of things that make for social systems. We, in this conversation, it's always easier for us to revert to physical systems or biological or ecological systems because they're more quantitative, as we saw from Harold's, Bill's version of Harold's presentation. We have numbers, we can identify the lithium requirements in an electric car battery and ask, are we going to run out of lithium in 50 years? And the cars will be, it's the end of the electric car world as we know it. So that's an easy, relatively speaking, an easy one. There are boundaries. They can be articulated. You can debate whether it's a little bit this way or a little bit that way, but at least we understand in these eco and physical and biological systems what the ingredients are and what the limits are and so on, the thresholds. The social systems, it's a much looser, it's culturally defined. You ask an indigenous group in Brazil what a social system is, versus a neighborhood in New York, what's their social system? You're going to get very different answers and worldviews of what a system is. So I think we have to be aware of that diversity and respect it. At the same time, go back to basics as to these four elements that I described: knowledge, culture, power, and I'm getting the fourth, sorry. And try to, in other words, unbundle what a social system is, and then devise an approach to take each element in itself and the combination of all elements as a whole to drive them forward to higher standards of return, if you will.
Great, thank you, Alan. And since this wasn't directed to a specific speaker, I would just, check in with Jane and Michelle if you had thoughts on this. Jane, maybe particularly in the supply chain context that SAI is so familiar with. How do you change social systems in an embedded supply chain context?
Yeah, I think first in the business context, it's interesting just rethinking how rethinking work and business and society is the way that humans have chosen to organize ourselves, and who makes those choices and how does that get designed, and how do we distribute more equally, not just the resource allocation, but the outputs and the benefits. And I think, when my examples about living wage and income in the social context, those are, to me, foundational because they represent the ability to, for individuals or, in a local context, to then have agency and designing their social construct and the way that they want to live. And right now, it's where the education, the work, all of the benefits coming from work, the dignity, all of those things are not, they're not decided by individual workers. They're not, they don't have the agency to create social change for themselves. So I think with the more systems-based thinking around resources and allocations and who gets to be at the table, I think that's where the social change starts to happen.
Great, thank you, Jane. And actually, what you're saying makes me think of a term that I didn't hear it, and excuse me if I missed it, but Alan, in one of his versions of his deck, had the term autarky, which I had never heard before, but aut as in self and archy as in governance. So it sounds like, the idea of self-governance is not baked into our social systems right now, and that's a key shift that we would need to take. Michelle, any thoughts that you have on this question of how to shift social systems, so behavior at a collective level, so to speak?
Yeah, I do. I see the opportunity for organizations to expand the concept of social responsibility so that it includes serving as commons. In some ways, businesses are modern day commons, and we don't have other plazas where we gather. Our neighborhoods are sort of devoid of that. And so in taking on that responsibility, every organization and every project can serve as a practice ground for creating a more thrivable world, for being in that informed intention and practice of aligning with life. So this is something that excites me, this explicit intention to offer a commons where we can influence and shape the larger social system.
Great, thank you. And that really brings us down to the end of this session. I want to thank our speakers, Alan White, Jane Huang, and Michelle Holliday, and also thank the version of Harold's Sverdrup who appeared today. So
kudos, Bill. Kudos.
Yeah, and thank you very much. And we will be seeing each of you in the interactive breakout sessions in subsequent days, so that we've structured it such that this is just a first taste of the interaction around these issues. So we would encourage participants in the conference to let these presentations and this initial dialogue sink in over the next 24 hours or so, and when we return tomorrow to this particular topic of science and behavior, we have 3 breakout sessions to go deeper onto those. And in fact, Michelle will actually be appearing later in the week in a session where she's jumping from science and behavior over into values and circularity in order to be in conversation with Jean Russell, who has also written a book about thrivability. So point being that there are plenty of opportunities to dig deeper. Consider this an opportunity to whet your appetite. So thank you very much to our speakers.